Nestled in the north, a land of ice and innovation, sandwiched between the vastness of Russia and the Scandinavian peninsula of Sweden, modern Finland is a paradox. It is consistently ranked the happiest country in the world, a nation known for its quiet resilience, its sauna culture, and its cutting-edge technology. It is a society that values personal space and social equality in almost equal measure. But historically, Finland is a very young nation. Its people have struggled and ultimately thrived through centuries of wars, famines, and general destruction, their identity forged in the crucible of competing empires. The story of how this cold northern land became the country it is today is a saga of ice, iron, and indomitable will. This is the history of Finland. To find the beginning, we must go back to the beginning. We must go back to the ice. Whether Finland was inhabited by humans before the last ice age is a mystery the land itself refuses to yield. The immense grinding ice sheet that covered the region acted as a natural eraser, scouring the bedrock and wiping away any traces of early human culture. There are tantalizing clues, of course. The so-called Wolf Cave has been suggested as a potential home for Neanderthals some 120,000 years ago. It's a compelling thought, a flicker of ancient life in the deep freeze. However, this theory is no longer supported by most scientists. If the Wolf Cave were ever proven to be a true Neanderthal dwelling, it would be a seismic discovery, rewriting the human map of prehistoric Europe. But for now, it remains an enigmatic maybe. The first trustworthy, undeniable signs of human habitation appear much later, around 8,800 BCE. This is when the world was warming, and the great ice sheet was in full retreat, its slow, groaning passage carving out the basins that would become Finland's thousands of lakes. The map, of course, looked profoundly different then, or it would have looked had there been anyone around to draw maps. The weight of the ice had pressed the land down, so the shoreline was much further inland than it is today. And it was this shoreline, the meeting point of land and water, that became the first highway and home for these pioneer settlers. These people were nomadic, their lives dictated by the seasons and the movements of game animals. They were adept hunters, taking moose, beaver, and crucially, seal. They were the first to listen to the whispers of this new land, and they kept companions, domestic dogs, already by humanity's side, aiding in the hunt and providing warmth in the long, dark winters. We call this period the Suomusjärvi culture, a name that speaks of a specific archaeological find, a label for a way of life that was, above all, about survival. It's worth pausing for perspective. While these small bands of Finnic ancestors were tracking game across the freshly exposed Scandinavian shield, the first cities were starting to appear in the Middle East. The very concept of civilization was being born in the Fertile Crescent, a world away from these frozen forests. Very few artifacts from this period in Finland survive. The soil is acidic and hostile to the preservation of bone and wood. What remains are stones, tools and weapons shaped by skilled hands. Just as we can say little about their material culture, we can say even less for sure about their beliefs, their dreams, their stories. Some of the older Finnish creation myths, recorded millennia later, bear a striking resemblance to those found in North America. This is not a coincidence, but a clue pointing to a common, ancient, circumpolar origin, a shared primordial worldview that stretched across the top of the world when the land bridges were still open. The remains of Stone Age burials from this early time indicate no beliefs in an afterlife. There are no grave goods, no provisions for a journey to another world. The realm of the dead, the gloomy Tuonela of later myth, was yet to be established in the Finnish consciousness. That concept and the practice of placing objects in graves would become common later as the world and its people grew more complex. The Stone Age lasted a long time in this northern corner of the world. Change was slow, measured in millennia, not centuries. But around 2800 BCE, a new god arrived in Finland. I'm of course talking about Ukko himself, who would later be considered the most important of the pagan Finnish gods. He was introduced by the corded ware culture, a new wave of people who spread to southwestern Finland from the Baltics. This culture has another much more memorable name, the battle axe culture, and it is no coincidence then that Ukko's divine weapon is a hammer axe, a direct reflection of the prized tools of the period. Ukko's arrival signaled a shift. He was a sky god, a god of weather and thunder. He would divide his celestial duties with the previous sky god, Ilmarinen. With Ukko taking the dominant role, Ilmarinen's portfolio shifted, becoming associated with the air, with wind, and crucially, with a new material that would soon change everything: iron. Later, he would add the position of a heroic mythical blacksmith to his resume. As agriculture slowly spread and the lifestyle became less purely nomadic, Ukko took on the duties of guarding the harvest. The weather on which the harvest depended became his domain. The people were putting down roots, both literally and metaphorically, and their gods evolved to reflect their new concerns. This was a time of mysterious monuments. On the shores of the Bothnian Bay, the so-called giants' churches were built around 3000 to 2000 BCE. This is roughly the same time as the Great Pyramids were rising in Egypt and the Indus Valley civilization was flourishing in South Asia. The giants' churches, however, were not built by the battle axe people, and we have no definitive idea what they were for. Theories abound. Were they fortresses, sacred offering sites, storage for seal meat? Or perhaps, like other megalithic constructions across Europe, they were astronomical observatories. The buildings often have their doorways facing the direction of sunrises and sunsets on equinox and solstice days, suggesting a deep connection to the cycles of the sun, a vital knowledge for survival in a land of extreme seasonal light. The battle axe people likely already practiced slash and burn agriculture. This dramatic sounding technique involved cutting down a section of forest, burning it, and farming the nutrient-rich ash-fertilized soil for a few years before moving on. This method prevailed in Finland far into the 19th century, a testament to both its effectiveness and the challenges of farming this northern land. It required constant migration, a semi-nomadic life even for those who farmed. It is also thought that during the time of the battle axe culture, the presumed Proto-Finnic language began to diverge, slowly splitting into the ancestors of the modern Finnish and Sami languages. I write this ambiguously on purpose, as the exact family tree of these languages is a complex and debated subject among linguists. And while we cannot prove it, researchers assume that the ancient Finnic peoples practiced a form of shamanism. The shaman was a powerful figure, an intermediary who could communicate with the spirit world, travel to the other world, and heal the sick. The entire world was believed to be infused with Veki, an omnipresent spirit or power that resided in everything: rocks, trees, animals, and water. This more or less concludes the Stone Age in Finland at around 1500 BCE. But history is not a series of clean breaks. The Stone Age was followed by, as you might guess, the Bronze Age, although initially it changed very little in the daily life of the average person. One small, almost ironic change is that the quality of pottery went down. Why? Because metal tools made woodworking much easier and preferable to clay. Why craft an intricate clay pot when you can carve a beautiful wooden bowl? The Bronze Age in Finland does not start with a high king named Seppo Kalevanpoika wielding a bronze sword and conquering the land in a single glorious campaign. That would be a great story, a founding myth, but the truth is more gradual, more archaeological. The use of bronze tools and weapons started spreading to the area of present-day Finland around 1500 BCE. We like to name these eras: Stone Age, Bronze Age, Iron Age. as if the appearance of a new material suddenly ended the use of the previous one. But that's not how life works. Imagine a farmer 3,500 years ago. A sturdy, reliable stone axe was still a valuable tool, even if his neighbor had a shiny new bronze dagger. Unlike stone and later iron, the ingredients for bronze, copper and tin, were not easily available in Finland. The metal was mostly imported. Because it was so troublesome to resource, stone tools prevailed alongside metal for a good long while. And it is only fitting then, in a historical pun that spans millennia, that the band Stone was one of the first metal bands in Finland, among the early pioneers of what would develop into an internationally renowned music scene. It would, however, take a while before metal became mainstream culture. So at first, the beginning of the Bronze Age saw very little change. Climate change, however, did have an impact. A shift to a cooler, wetter climate likely shrunk the population, as fewer sites of human habitation are known from this period than from the late Stone Age. Nor have archaeologists discovered a great number of bronze objects, underscoring its rarity and value. With the changing climate, the flora and fauna changed as well. The spruce, now the iconic Finnish tree, spread successfully, while the number of large mammals in the woods dropped. The number of seals, a crucial game animal, also decreased, putting pressure on the coastal communities. People still lived close to waterways, the natural arteries of travel and communication. Good hunting and fishing grounds were paramount. International trade, although international is not quite the right word, as nations hadn't been invented yet, started to grow, centering around two precious commodities, bronze and amber. This trade network spread not only across the bay to Sweden, but all the way from the Baltic Sea to the Mediterranean. Amber from the north was traded for bronze from the south. This undoubtedly spread cultural influence too, ideas traveling with the traders. One can imagine the primitive ancestors of today's Finns party grumbling about these foreign influences, a timeless human reaction. The Bronze Age culture was not uniform. It was different in eastern and western Finland, a divergence that would echo throughout history. Agriculture was more prominent in the west, which was more heavily influenced by its Scandinavian connections. The east was more connected to the Bronze Age cultures in modern-day Russia. Houses became more and more permanent, usually appearing as single homesteads, though occasional groups or villages are known too. Some defensive hill forts were already in use during the Bronze Age, which suggests a level of social organization larger than a single village, either cooperation between villages or the emergence of a chieftain who could command the labor to build and man such structures. The Bronze Age likely saw major changes in people's beliefs. The spread of agriculture and permanent settlements required new kinds of deities compared to a pure hunter-gatherer society. The harvest became more crucial for survival, and Ukko, the sky god, would have taken on the role of its protector, though exactly when is lost to time. Further evidence of changing beliefs comes from new burial customs. Burial mounds or barrows start to appear, as well as the practice of cremation. The burial mounds called hiidenkiukat start to appear around the turn of the Stone Age to the Bronze Age along the coastline, which was in closer contact with the Scandinavian Bronze Age peoples. Some of the mounds contain objects, a dagger, a piece of jewelry placed with the dead. Others do not. Similar mounds, but in a rectangular shape, are called church floors, and similar mounds deeper inland are called Lapland's ruins. It's important to note that Lapland, or Lappi, used to mean wilderness, not a specific ethnic region. Burying the dead under heavy stones could indicate a desire to prevent the dead from returning to harass the living. Such beliefs were common later on and have been well documented. But of course, with the Bronze Age, we cannot say for sure. The graves were often built gradually, first for one important member of the family, to be later expanded with more bodies, becoming a family plot. The word heidenkuus means roughly troll's stove, but Hisi was originally not a troll, but a sacred place, a grove or a hill. As one might guess, the Christian church later tainted this word to describe a malicious forest-dwelling creature. It is this later demonized Hisi which gives its name to the burial mounds. Bronze was, of course, precious, and ownership was likely limited to people of high status and wealth. As the existence of the large trade network suggests, the Bronze Age people went to great lengths to acquire it. Bronze objects were not only imported, but also crafted locally. The imported swords and daggers that have been found are similar in design to weapons found in Central Europe. A distinct local metal culture would only start to take a unique shape later on, in the Iron Age. We don't know much about the language, but it is thought that the Baltic Finnic languages started to take shape and diverge into Proto-Sami and Proto-Finnish. According to historian Ilari Aalto, and note, this is contrary to what I implied earlier about the Stone Age, the Proto-Sami language was the first of the two to spread to most of Finland. This explains why Sami place names are found even in southern Finland, a linguistic fossil of an earlier, wider distribution. That more or less concludes the Bronze Age at around 500 BCE. As said earlier, little changed initially compared to the Stone Age, and the division is a little artificial. The Bronze and the beginning of the Iron Age are, for that reason, sometimes grouped together as the Early Metal Age. Think Black Sabbath, Judas Priest and Iron Maiden, the foundational era. Then came iron, and iron changed everything. The use of iron started to spread into Finland from the east, around 500 BCE. Unlike bronze, which had to be imported, iron was a democratizing force. It was available in the Finnish soil, in the lakes and bogs, in the form of limonite. It wasn't necessary to rely on long-distance trade networks, so the knowledge of ironworking spread rather quickly across Finland. The local metal scene started to truly take a unique shape. Weapons and jewelry developed their own distinctive styles. The music, so to speak, was heavily melodic, a contrast to the more uniform styles of the Bronze Age. The use of bronze didn't end, of course, but it focused more on jewelry than weapons and tools. Iron, as a lighter, sturdier and more readily available material, was game-changing for agriculture and warfare. It is at this point where farming became the dominant livelihood in the south and west, while hunter-gatherer societies, including the Sami, prevailed deeper inland in the vast wilderness. Because iron was such a game-changer, it also heavily affected the beliefs of the time. The birth of iron is a central magical event in many of the ancient Finnish runes and myths. The metal was given supernatural powers. An iron tool or weapon hung above a door or window was believed to repel evil spirits and trolls. Life, it seems, did not end with death, or so we can assume based on the rich burials from the Iron Age, which included weapons, tools, and personal ornaments, objects the deceased would need in the afterlife. But there was also a fear of the dead. The dead could return to harass the living, and possibly for this reason, the swords placed in graves were sometimes deliberately broken. Or it could have been a practical measure to prevent grave robberies. The cemeteries were often sacred places, many of which were later largely defiled and destroyed by the Christian Church. Burial practices evolved. At first, cremation was common, until Christian habits of inhumation in coffins started to slowly gain a foothold centuries later. This new religion spread slowly from both the Catholic Church after the conversion of Scandinavia and from the Orthodox Church in the East. But the Finnic tribes largely remained pagan during the Iron Age, their world still empowered by the omnipresent Väki. One of the first written accounts of Finnic peoples comes from the Roman historian Tacitus in his work Germania from around 98 CE. He writes of the Feni, a people who lived in astonishing barbarity and wretchedness. Whether he actually referred to the ancestors of modern Finns, the Sami, or some other people, we may never know. but the Proto-Finn theory has been suggested by scholars like Professor Juha Pentikainen. Another Iron Age mention is from the Anglo-Saxon poem Widsith, which is sometimes interpreted to mention a mythical Finnish king named Kaliva. Although some of the old bronze trade routes died out during the Iron Age, trading didn't end by any means. Furs became the most important export product. The valuable pelts of beaver, sable, and fox were in high demand in the south, and the Vikings' eastern route, a mighty trade and raid artery that ran all the way to the Black Sea and Constantinople, passed by the Finnish coast. Finland was a stop along the way, a likely place to ask for directions for navigating the rugged island-strewn archipelago. But the interaction between the different peoples wasn't always sunshine and rainbows. Runestones in Sweden and the Norse sagas tell of Viking raids to Finland that ended in bloodshed. In response, networks of hill forts, which had their origins in the Bronze Age, were in active use during this time. The people apparently used them with great success in defending against these raids. The saga of Olaf Haraldsson provides a vivid, if mythologized, account. They sailed to Finland and plundered there and went up the country. All the people fled to the forest, and they had emptied their houses of all household goods. The king went far up the country and through some woods, and came to some dwellings in a valley called Herdala, where, however, they made but small booty and saw no people. And as it was getting late in the day, the king turned back to his ships. Now, when they came into the woods again, people rushed upon them from all quarters and made a severe attack. The king told his men to cover themselves with their shields, but before they got out of the woods, he lost many people, and many were wounded. But at last, late in the evening, he got to the ships. The Finlanders conjured up in the night, by their witchcraft, a dreadful storm and bad weather on the sea, but the king ordered the anchors to be weighed and sail hoisted, and beat off all night to the outside of the land. The king's luck prevailed more than the Finlanders' witchcraft, for he had the luck to beat round the Balagard's side in the night, and so got out to sea. But the Finnish army proceeded on land, making the same progress as the king made with his ships. Despite being a saga filled with supernatural elements, we can glean that the Finnic tribes were often more than capable of repelling attackers. It is worth noting that there was no national Finnish identity yet, nor would there be for centuries. There were tribes, the Finns proper, the Tavastians, Heimi, the Karelians, who spoke early forms of Finnish and fought against each other as much as against outsiders. The larger hill forts could have served as centres of government as well, although we can't say for sure. The lack of written evidence does not mean that something couldn't have existed. It is likely that chieftains or petty kings ruled over several settlements. The strong presence of these high-status weapons paints an entirely different picture of Iron Age Finland than the common idea of mud-dwelling savages, a stereotype that was deeply rooted in people's minds during the later period of Swedish rule. Of course, it was a tough time to be alive by modern standards. The climate, although slightly warmer than today during the Roman warm period, was still harsh. Survival took a lot of effort. Both men and women played important roles in daily tasks, and this potentially led to a greater appreciation of women's status in Northern Europe compared to some other contemporary societies. The houses were wooden, built with horizontal logs or with earth-covered stave frames. They typically had only one room with a hearth in the middle for cooking and heating. There were no chimneys, only small vents where the smoke would escape slowly, leaving a thick cloud of smoke by the ceiling. This method of heating also preserved the meat and fish hung from the rafters. Farming, hunting, and foraging were the rhythm of daily life. Besides the previously introduced domestic animals, horses started to appear during the Iron Age, adding a new dimension to travel, trade, and warfare. The clothing was nothing like the studded leather and biker vests seen in some modern fantasy shows. Clothing was made of practical materials: wool, linen, hemp, furs, and even nettle. Wealthier people would display their status with extensive bronze jewelry and more colourful imported fabrics. Because people didn't own piles of fast fashion garbage like today, clothes were higher quality, made to last, and repaired until they fell apart. In the year 1066, the Viking Age is traditionally said to have ended in England. But all the Vikings didn't just hang their axes and shields on the wall and retire. This wasn't the case with Finland and the Finnic peoples. Raiding, that typical Viking Age hobby, remained a popular pastime well into the period of the European High Middle Ages. Across the Baltic Sea, the Swedish tribes had started adopting a new faith, Christianity, and were slowly abandoning their old beliefs. Slowly but surely, Sweden would also consolidate herself into one kingdom with a ruling monarch. Flipping their Thor's hammers upside down and adding a Jesus to them didn't seem to stop their thirst for raiding, however. It merely added an element of religious conversion to the popular and profitable activity. During the Viking Age, Scandinavian Viking settlements were scarce inside Finland, but from the 11th century onwards, the Swedes started to increasingly colonize the Finnish coast. Their rule became stronger over the centuries, and much of today's Finland was gradually consolidated into the Kingdom of Sweden. A new era was dawning, one of crusades, castles, and Christ. In medieval and later texts, this colonization is dubbed as a series of crusades against the pagan Finns. This is, however, largely propaganda and mythical history created centuries later to justify the rule of kings and the church in the Middle Ages. According to this traditional lore, the Swedes launched 3 crusades into Finland from approximately 1150 to 1293. The First Crusade, led by the legendary King Eric the Holy, who was accompanied by Bishop Henry, is a well-known tale. It follows a pattern similar to other European martyr legends, classic Christian propaganda of the time. According to this legend, the king launched a crusade against the Finnic pagans, and after the king left, the bishop remained in Finland, establishing the local branch of the Catholic Church. He was then brutally murdered by the Finnish pagan Lalli on the ice of Lake Koilliönjärvi. This act of martyrdom earned him the title of Finland's patron saint. Apparently, the bar for Catholic bishops was low, as getting murdered as an invader was considered a significant achievement. The same could be said for the biblical figure Noah, who, according to an old Finnish translation, was considered a decent man for knowing to hang his towel on a rack when going into the sauna. There is, of course, no concrete proof that either of these legendary characters ever existed. Bishop Henry and Lalli, that is. Well, there's no proof of the biblical Noah either. Nevertheless, they have remained powerful and popular figures in Finnish folklore for centuries. Interestingly, the murderer Lalli, whose name is ironically of Christian origin, Laurentius, transformed through the centuries from an evil pagan barbarian into a patriotic hero who resisted foreign conquest and foreign gods. Of the legendary 3 crusades, only the third one can be said with certainty to have taken place as a defined military campaign. Archaeological evidence, as well as place names, suggest that not only Swedes but also Danes and potentially Germans did their share of this violent tourism. So the Crusades to Finland can be seen as a part of the larger campaign of the conquest and conversion of the heathens of Northern Europe. A special pat on the shoulder and seal of approval goes to the Lithuanians for remaining the last pagans in Europe, officially converting not until 1387. We don't know many details of how exactly the church and the new faith gained a foothold. Black metal songs tend to portray it as a brutal, violent oppression and slaughter, and the church certainly did destroy old pagan shrines and build churches on top of them. A Pope Alexander III's letter from 1171 or 1172 to the Archbishop of Uppsala heavily complains about the pagan Finns mocking the Christian faith and trolling the church. They would pretend to be good Christians when threatened with the sword, but immediately after they would harass the priests and make fun of the religion. On the other hand, archaeologist Ilari Aalto argues that the church likely cared little about the beliefs of individual Finns as long as that area could be counted as Catholic in the ledgers back in Rome. Christian beliefs were gradually adopted and added to, rather than replacing Finnic paganism. It is likely that Jesus, Jehovah, the saints, and other Christian figures took their seats in the pantheon alongside Ukko, Tapio, and Ahti before partially replacing the pagan deities over generations. Jehovah and Ukko, both sky gods and wielders of thunder, probably influenced each other and got eventually mixed up in the popular mind. The worldview of a slowly Christianizing Finn was quite different from that of a Christian in southern Europe or the Crusader states. The masses were held in the local language, not Latin, a common myth, and the clergy used familiar pagan terminology to explain foreign concepts. The underworldly punishment, for example, was dubbed Tuonela after the Finnish realm of the dead and hell in Germanic areas. Countless traces of old pagan words can be found in the older Finnish translations of the Bible. For example, giants have been dubbed Kalevan Pojat after the mythical primordial Finnish giants. It should, of course, be noted that there was no Finnish nation or identity at this point. People likely identified as members of their family, their village, or their tribe. For the sake of convenience, though, I gather the Finnic tribes living in present-day Finland under the umbrella of Finns in these videos, and you just have to deal with it. The Swedish grip on the country got stronger as time passed. The Swedish-speaking settlers were often given privileges over the Finnish-speaking population, as they also largely formed the new ruling class. The Erik Chronicle, the oldest surviving Swedish chronicle, describes the Swedish crusades to Tavastia and Karelia. It is assumed that the Heme castle was built following one of these campaigns. The construction of castles was key to reinforcing Swedish rule, both against the Finnic tribes and against the Novgorodians of modern-day Russia. The Novgorodian chronicles also describe multiple deadly conflicts with Finnic tribes from the 11th or 12th century to the early 13th century. The Erik Chronicle also describes the Karelians looting the Swedish town of Sigtuna in 1187. It is also said that they repeated this fun activity in 1257. These events were used as grounds to launch the Third Swedish Crusade into Finland against the Karelians in 1293. This bloody expedition was followed by the construction of the strategic Viborg Castle, allegedly by the orders of the Marshal Torkel Knutsson, Lord High Constable of Sweden. The raids among the Finns, Swedes and Novgorodians would continue regardless until 1323. That's when Sweden and Novgorod got so exhausted by the constant bloodshed that they drew a line on the map, defining the borders of both realms for the first time. This is known as the Treaty of Göteborg, and it ends the Crusade era and marks the formal beginning of the Middle Ages in Finland as a defined political entity. After the legendary Crusades and the settling of the Swedish colonizers, the Finnish Middle Ages proper begin. The Iron Age tribal society with its petty kings was slowly replaced by the rule of the Swedish lords and the church, although it may not have affected the daily lives of the common people that much, at least at first. Finland proper, Tavastia and Karelia formed the eastern part of the Swedish kingdom, which was called Österland, the Eastland, from the 14th century onwards. One of the most iconic images of medieval Europe is the stone castle. Such was the case in Finland too. These impressive structures served as giant symbols of power, means of defense, residences for the local lord, and centers of government. Sweden was divided into castle fiefs, and Österland into 8 of them, each ruled by a steward who would collect taxes, deliver justice, and maintain the defense of the area. A crucial distinction between Sweden and much of Europe is that Sweden did not develop a classic feudal system, although they had knights. nor were the peasant serfs forcibly tied to the land like in much of Europe. They were, for the most part, free tax-paying farmers. The peasants and farmers made up the vast majority of the population. Other estates included the frälse, in Finnish, relsi, formed by the nobility and clergy who were exempt from tax, and the tongue-twisting bourgeoisie, essentially a medieval business class, a wealthy urban elite running the business in cities. The Middle Ages are often referred to as the Dark Ages, and this goes for Finland too. But for the average farmer, life in the Finnish Middle Ages was arguably much better than it would be in the 1600s, right after this period. The tax burden was lighter, and they had more control over their local affairs. The most important city and the seat of Swedish rule in Österland was Turku. Porvoo, Viipuri, Ulvila, Rauma, and Naantali were smaller cities, all located along important waterways where rivers meet the sea. The cities were run by a council of the bourgeoisie. While trade happened largely in towns, the countryside was the breadbasket of the country. Österland had a total population of around 200,000, and Turku, the largest city, had only about 1,500 people. This starkly shows the overwhelming importance of the medieval countryside. The peasants mostly owned the land themselves, unlike later in history. A wealthy peasant could even advance to the frälse by mustering and maintaining a mounted man-at-arms for the king's service. The countryside consisted of small agricultural villages. Slash-and-burn farming was still common, although not the only method. The villages were very self-sufficient, as buying anything was expensive, and trade was officially only permitted in towns. The medieval peasant's diet was perhaps surprisingly healthy and varied. Broad beans and peas were common sources of plant protein, while cereal, that is bread, porridge and pottage, was the base of the diet. Hunting and fishing, of course, provided additional nutrition, as did ale, which was low in alcohol and high in calories, and generally much safer to drink than water, especially in the cities. The same food was often eaten on set days of the week, a habit that is still preserved in the form of pea soup on Thursdays in Finnish schools and the military. Food was often pickled, salted, smoked, or cured to preserve it. People kept domestic animals like sheep, chickens, and goats, but mostly for their milk, eggs, and wool, as slaughtering an animal for food was not economically sensible except for special occasions. Meat spoiled easily, and peasants ate it mostly during the Kekri harvest festival and Yule feasts when animals were slaughtered. The clergy and nobility were, of course, more wealthy and thus more carnivorous, as is pretty much always the case in history. Their feasts in the castles and manors could include imported wine, which was very sweet by today's standards. A medieval lord's meal could include both savoury and sweet dishes at the same time, as the modern concept of desserts hadn't been invented. Eating roast chicken with honey cakes would have been perfectly normal for them. How did people get around? Most of the country was still wilderness. The sea level, which was low after the Ice Age, was still receding, and ships could no longer sail upriver in many places as they once could. Roads were built to connect major towns and castles. The so-called Tavastian Ox Road from Turku to Hämeenlinna is still partially intact and can be hiked today. Summer and winter were the best seasons for travelling. In the winter, the waterways froze and could be easily crossed with skis or sleighs. Bandits troubled journey makers in Europe, and while they did harass people travelling across Finland too, the wild beasts of the forests were probably a more common nuisance. As pagan beliefs remained strong, mentioning the bear's name in the woods was out of the question, as it was believed to summon the beast. The best travel insurance was moving in larger groups and carrying a spear, and later a crossbow. Taverns served travellers along major roads. In the towns, there were also alehouses and public saunas that might have offered more intimate services after dark. Contrary to popular belief, medieval people didn't only bathe once a year, although the towns were quite filthy with litter on the streets. Bathhouses and saunas in Finland were a common sight. The downside was that while they were effective in maintaining hygiene, they were also effective in spreading disease, with the most famous epidemic being, what else but the Black Death. It seems, however, that Finland was spared from its first, most devastating wave in the 1340s. While under Swedish rule, German influence was strong, especially in the cities. The Hanseatic League, a powerful confederation of merchant guilds, controlled the trade in the Baltic Sea, doing business in Österland as well. German was not an uncommon language to hear in the cities, alongside Finnish, Swedish and Russian, according to Olaus Magnus's description of the northern peoples, 1555. The language of the clergy was Latin, and the Sami spoke, unsurprisingly, Sami languages. The Middle Ages was a relatively decent period to be alive in the history of Finland, but as with all periods of relative calm, it was not destined to last. The 15th century would bring new conflicts, ones that would earn grim names and cement a long-standing animosity. The relative stability of the earlier Middle Ages was shattered towards the end of the 15th century. In 1478, Novgorod was swallowed by the rising power of Moscow. Moscow was not happy about the Finnish settlements spreading beyond the 1323 borders, and a war was fought from 1495 to 1497. It resulted in no formal change to the borders, but caused an immense amount of destruction in Finland. It is no wonder that it would become known as the Vanha Viha, the Old Wrath in Finnish. The turn of the century saw the Kalmar Union, the personal union of Sweden, Denmark and Norway, starting to break apart for good. This manifested itself in wars which spread to Finland too. Turku and Porvoo, for example, were burned. The turn of the 15th and 16th centuries was a turbulent era of unrest in Finland. The Middle Ages was ending, as the Finns would slowly awake to the dawn of the modern age, an age of reformation, royal power and even greater wars. Dysfunctional Kalmar Union was breaking, with Danish forces repeatedly laying waste to Sweden, including her Finnish territories. In 1520, King Christian II of Denmark marched to Stockholm and had himself crowned King of the Union. He had invited the Swedish nobility to Stockholm, promising to pardon his opponents. They swallowed the bait, and Christian had them imprisoned and performed a separation of the heads from the necks of his male opponents at the city square. This would be known as the Stockholm bloodbath and was done to intimidate the Swedes into submission. Turns out it had the opposite effect. The Swedes rose against the Danish king, led by a nobleman named Gustav Vasa, whose father was one of those executed. The Swedish War of Liberation raged from 1521 to 1523. By 1523, King Christian was dethroned, and Gustav Vasa was crowned King of Sweden. Österland, that is Finland, was declared part of Sweden again. This marks the end of the Middle Ages in Finland. The next roughly 100 years are known as the Vasa Age. This era saw a bunch of changes that modernized the country and centralized power. So what changed for the average farmer? Initially, not that much. They still formed the backbone of society, farming and eating pottage, typically the same food for each day of the week. This custom is, by the way, carried on to this day in the form of pea soup on Thursdays. A few years prior, a German priest named Martin Luther had stomped on the Pope's feet with biblical aggression. His aim was to reform the Catholic Church, which he found greedy and corrupt. Although it was likely not Luther's goal, what he set in motion left much of Europe soaked with blood and in ruins, involving the Swedish armies with their Finnish forces as well. Like much of the state under Vasa's rule, the church underwent a reformation. This meant shifting power and wealth away from the church and to the king. This suited the king just fine. The bishop's castle of Kuusisto was demolished, ridding the church of its military power. It It also involved making the church more accessible to the people according to the Lutheran principles. This included translating the Bible into the vernacular languages Swedish and Finnish. The man for the task in Finland was Mikael Agricola, the Bishop of Turku and a student of Luther's ideas. He is often known as the father of written Finnish, and this is mostly true as his ABC-kirja was the first book published in Finnish in 1543. It is likely, though, that priests and other literate Finnish speakers had been writing notes for themselves in Finnish before Agricola, but none have been preserved. In the preface of his New Testament translation, Agricola lists the pagan gods of Tavastia and Karelia. While the list is by no means an accurate depiction of paganism at the time, it is priceless evidence of surviving heathen beliefs well into the reformed Lutheran Finland. The growing realm needed a history for its people, so one was made up. The Swedes and Finns claimed to descend from biblical heroes and ancient civilizations. This, of course, was nonsense, but that was not important. It was about creating a glorious past for a nascent state. All this founding of cities and translating of Bibles is cool, but what would an episode of this series be without another war against Russia? As we remember, the Russo-Swedish border was long disputed. This escalated to a full-blown war in 1555, known in Finnish as the Great Russian War. Although the Finnish ski troops are best known from the Winter War hundreds of years later, Sweden used them to great advantage under the command of a Finnish noble, Juho Maunun Poika. Despite some successes, the war ended in a truce with no formal changes to the border. Not that it mattered much, for another war was fought from 1570 to 1595, known in Finnish as the Long Wrath. On Finland's soil, it was largely a brutal guerrilla war, associated with the legendary warlord Pekka Vesanen. A peace treaty was signed in 1595, and this time parts of the border were redrawn, with Sweden gaining areas in northern Finland. While the farmers were ravaged by war, the nobility were tasting the flavors of the Renaissance, which had finally reached the north. A key figure was Queen Catherine Jagiellon and her Renaissance court in Turku Castle. As you can imagine, all the fighting had taken its toll on the Finnish peasants. Besides heavy taxes to fund the wars, they were required to host and supply the armies. The nobility, on the other hand, often benefited from the wars, gaining new territories and loot. Meanwhile, a conflict over the Swedish throne between King Sigismund, III Vasa, and his uncle Duke Charles spilled over into Finland. The governor of Finland, Klaus Fleming, was a supporter of Sigismund. Charles promised to relieve the peasants of the burden of hosting armies to gain their support. Fleming responded by strengthening his iron grip on the country and terrorizing the peasants. The situation became intolerable. By the end of 1595, the peasants had had enough. They took up arms, led by a nobleman named Jaakko Ilkka. Their revolt, known as the Cudgel War, inspired similar peasant armies across the country, but they were no match for Fleming's heavily armed and trained troops. The rebellion was crushed with great cruelty, with promises of pardon being broken and the rebels slaughtered after laying down their arms. Fleming's armies then plundered the countryside. The wars and the rebellion had left the Finnish population weak, and this was not helped by the Great Famine of 1601, which spread death and disease across the land. The warm climate of the early Middle Ages had cooled into what's sometimes called the Little Ice Age, which certainly didn't help agriculture. Luckily for the Finns, they then got to enjoy permanent peace and prosperity. Just kidding. What followed was even more wars and death as Sweden, under the Vasa dynasty, rose to become a great military power, and Finland would provide much of its cannon fodder. By the 1600s, Sweden was no longer a small, irrelevant kingdom. The internal power struggles were over and the peasant revolts crushed. The neighbouring realms around the Baltic Sea, however, were still eagerly playing their games of thrones. Taking advantage of this, Sweden rose to be a great power in Europe in the 17th century, often called the Swedish Empire. The beginning of this era started in 1611, with the 16-year-old King Gustav II Adolf rising to the throne. His and his successors' continuous reforms to both the administration and military made Sweden a formidable realm. What did this mean for the Finns? Well, they were arguably largely neglected when it came to the benefits of the reforms, although the period of Governor-General Per Brahe the Younger is often seen favourably. On the other hand, they did get to enjoy more of their personal space for a century, as the wars were now fought on foreign soil, sparing their homes from destruction for a change. The vast majority of Finns were still farmers, who, together with the trading bourgeoisie, formed the bottom class of society. Above them were the clergy, and finally the nobility, who adopted over-the-top Baroque fashion. A European trend of the 1600s that was copied in Finland, especially in Åland and Ostrobothnia, were witch hunts. Although folk magic was still very common, the scale was smaller than in Central Europe. We know of no more than 100 death sentences for witchcraft in 17th century Finland. In the spirit of European absolutism, the power of the king and central government were strengthened. This meant that farmers in remote corners of the realm had less control over their local decision-making. Their position and standard of living arguably decreased compared to the Middle Ages. Speaking of war, we arrive at the raging battlefields of the 30 Years' War. The scale and destruction of this war is hard to comprehend today. It left millions of corpses behind. Sweden entered the conflict in 1630, and the Swedish intervention was key in changing the course of the war in favour of the Protestants. The Swedish army was cleverly modernized by Gustav II Adolf. As described by Mikko Laakso, Adolf's artillery and cavalry were lighter and more mobile, and the entire army was well coordinated. Around a third of this army consisted of Finnish troops, who often formed the majority of the famous cavalry. These horsemen, later called Hakapelitat, have achieved a legendary status in Finnish history, known for their close-range charges and their war cry, Hakaa Päällä, strike them down. While the Finnish farmers formed a large part of the conquering armies, they didn't enjoy the spoils of war. Unlike the nobility, who had pretty much turned Swedish by this point, the common Finnish soldier returned home, if he returned at all, to the same farm and the same taxes. The conflict-ending Peace of Westphalia in 1648 has often been seen as a starting point for the concept of state sovereignty. Sweden, however, continued to fight its neighbours. All this fighting left the economy underdeveloped, although some new cities, including Oulu, Vasa and Kokkola, were formed around the tar business, Finland's major export. However, as I've probably said dozens of times now, most people got their livelihood from farming. As a country so far north that agriculture was on the verge of being worth it at all, Finland was highly vulnerable to bad weather and crop failures. And bad weather indeed occurred for 2 disastrous years in a row, leading to the Great Famine of 1695 to 1697. With the king's focus on wars, the famine swept across the land, leaving piles of corpses behind. Partly due to the mercantilist economy, food could not be bought even by those who could afford it in the second year of hunger. Up to a third of Finland's population died of hunger and resulting diseases. This makes it one of the worst naturally occurring famines in European history, its scale of devastation directly comparable to the Black Death. News of the disaster travelled slowly, and in a stunning display of bureaucratic blindness, the state administration reportedly thought that people were dying on purpose to avoid paying taxes. Meanwhile, Sweden's enemies had not been idle. By 1699, Denmark, Norway, Russia, Poland and Saxony had formed a powerful alliance. This led to the Great Northern War, 1700 to 1721, a conflict that would end the Swedish Empire. Because, as history shows us time after time, every empire will fall. Sweden had bitten off more land than it could chew, especially with the teeth of a small famine-ravaged population. Although Sweden saw initial success, their advance towards Moscow was halted. The following Battle of Poltava in 1709 saw nearly the entire Swedish army captured or annihilated. The following decade, the crumbling Swedish realm was playing defense. The enemies pushed further into Swedish-held lands, including the Russian occupation of Finland from 1714 to 1721. This period would be known as the Iso-Viha, the Great Wrath. The Russian army systematically destroyed as much of Finland as they could. The orders from Emperor Peter the Great were to ravage the Bothnian coast so that Sweden's forces could never again advance eastward from there. Cities were burned to the ground, their populations massacred, raped and enslaved. The violence was more brutal the further they advanced, peaking in the region of Ostrobothnia. The practices of mass torture and murder have a dedicated word nowadays: genocide. Whoever could flee across the Gulf of Bothnia to Sweden would. This was more achievable for the higher estates. The peasants' fate was to try and hide in the woods, trying not to starve. It is often said that the Finns' generational caution towards the East, often labelled as Russophobia by Kremlin propaganda, has much of its roots in the visceral lived trauma of the Great Wrath. It is also often considered the darkest era in all of Finnish history. In contrast, everything that comes after in these videos seems like sunshine and rainbows. And indeed, the battered post-Great Wrath country saw some reforms. A key one was the Great Partition, Iso-Jako, which replaced the medieval open field system. Now, the small and scattered patches of fields were merged into contiguous farms. This resulted in a significant increase in agricultural production and wealth, but it also effectively ended the traditional village community, leading to the decline of shared sacred places like springs and hills. It may have been in the interests of the ruling class to keep the peasants isolated from each other so they wouldn't congregate and come up with any undesirable ideas. Combined with the presumed caution following the horrors of the Great Wrath, this could have contributed to the famous Finnish introvertedness and love of personal space to this day. While many peasants found themselves in a better position, the period also saw a great increase in the number of non-wealthy tenant farmers, torporate. These were landless peasants who rented a plot and a hut from a landowner, paying their rent with labour. The peasants also bore the weight of the new allotment system, Ruotujako, where a group of farms was responsible for equipping and supporting one soldier for the king's army. These soldiers of the era wore the iconic blue greatcoats with yellow cuffs, a Carolean fashion that remained long after the era itself ended. The extravagant manners of the nobility were decorated lavishly in the neoclassical Gustavian style from the 1780s, named after King Gustav III, who was famously assassinated at a masked opera ball in 1792. One important figure from this era was Anders Kaidinius, 1729 to 1803, a priest and politician and the leading classical liberal in Nordic history. His achievements include the liberation of the tar business in Ostrobothnia, which brought increased wealth to the region, as well as the world's first Freedom of the Press Act in 1766. Another key figure was Henrik Gabriel Porthon, 1739 to 1804, whose work laid the foundation for this channel, among other things. Porthon is often called the father of Finnish history, as he delved into Finland's history and folklore with a new attention to proper source criticism, which was groundbreaking at the time. Meanwhile, Russia had taken Sweden's place as a great power. By the early 1800s, Napoleon's France was at odds with Britain. Napoleon forced much of Europe into a continental blockade against the UK. Russia, after suffering a defeat against Napoleon, joined this blockade. Sweden, however, maintained its lucrative trade with Britain. Napoleon ordered Russia to force Sweden into line. So, in February 1808, Russia attacked Finland. Sweden's strategy was a disaster. Key sea forts surrendered, and Russian forces once again marched across Finland. To the surprise of many, including possibly the Russian Emperor Alexander I himself, the campaign resulted in the full annexation of Finland to the Russian Empire in 1809. Sweden's 600-year rule was over. Finland was now a grand duchy within the Russian Empire. This period from 1809 to 1917 is known as the Age of Autonomy. The name is not used without reason. Afraid of the Finns longing for Sweden and wary of Napoleon, Emperor Alexander I granted Finland significant privileges. A customs border was created with Russia. Taxes collected in Finland were spent on Finland. The hated allotment system was abolished. Territories were returned and Swedish laws were retained, as were the estates privileges and the Lutheran Church. These were smart moves. The occupation was relatively bloodless, and the Finns became stable, loyal subjects until they weren't. The small town of Helsinki was made the new capital, being closer to St. Petersburg and further from Sweden. We like to call Turku the old capital, but I argue that Helsinki is, in fact, the first true capital of Finland as a distinct political entity. The initial effects on the people were insignificant. The top of society was still mostly Swedish-speaking. The majority were Finnish-speaking peasants, labourers, and the landless. Only the estates sent representatives to the Diet, which, tellingly, was not assembled once between 1809 and 1863, an era nicknamed the Age of Bureaucracy. Finland was still a poor agrarian society. Industrialization started late. The father of Finnish industry, James Finlayson, opened Finland's first modern factory in Tampere. The first Finnish railway, from Helsinki to Hämeenlinna, opened in 1862, which brings us to the last great natural famine in European history, in the 1860s. The Finnish famine of 1866 to 1868 killed 8 to 10% of the population, 150,000 to 200,000 people. Poor harvests, preceded by the destruction of the Åland War, a side theatre of the Crimean War, led to a food shortage, amplified by the government's inability to react. They thought unconditional aid would corrupt the nation's morality. Many of us remember grandparents who insisted we finish all the food on our plates. Their own grandparents were survivors of this famine, and that trauma echoes down the generations. Despite the famine, Finland's population grew, thanks in part to vaccines against diseases like smallpox. And as the nation's population grew, so did its spirit. Nationalism was booming in the 19th century Europe. Finns too started to seek their own identity. As the early nationalist Adolf Ivar Arvidsson reportedly said, "Swedes we are not, Russians we cannot become, let us therefore be Finns." Besides Arvidsson, figures like Elias Lönnrot, the compiler of the national epic Kalevala, and Johan Ludvig Runeberg, the national poet who wrote in Swedish, forged a new Finnish identity. The first Finnish-language novel, Seven Brothers by Alexis Kivi, was published in 1870. Minna Canth, Finland's first prominent feminist, followed with socially critical realist works. In 1863, a crucial step was taken. The Finnish language decree pronounced Finnish equal to Swedish in matters concerning the Finnish-speaking population. This nice and chill era of Russian rule ended with Emperor Nicholas II. His goal was to Russify Finland and other minorities, a period known as the Years of Oppression. This led to widespread opposition. The first era of oppression ended with the murder of the Governor-General of Finland, Nikolai Bobrikov, in 1904, and the general strike of 1905. The following year, 1906, Finnish women became the third in the world to gain the right to vote and the first in the world to be elected as members of parliament. This era also became the golden age of Finnish art. A second period of oppression started shortly after, aiming to undermine Finnish legislative power. This led to the formation of the Jaeger movement, Finnish volunteers secretly training in the German army during World War I. They did not, however, need to fight for freedom, as Russia's 1917 revolutions created the perfect opportunity. With the old empire in chaos, the Finnish parliament declared itself the supreme authority, followed by a declaration of independence, which was accepted by the parliament on December 6, 1917. The Bolshevik leader Vladimir Lenin, preoccupied with his own survival, accepted Finland's independence. For the first time in history, Finns had a country of their own. It all went smoothly from there. Just kidding. Freshly independent countries often end up in civil war, and Finland was no exception. The tensions between the conservative white government and the left-wing Red Workers' movement exploded into a brutal civil war in January 1918. The war was short but bloody, with the Battle of Tampere being a decisive turning point. The whites, supported by Germany, won. The aftermath was even more brutal, with thousands of Red prisoners dying in prison camps. The nation was deeply divided. After the war, the whites briefly worked to establish a kingdom with a German prince, but Germany's defeat in WWI put an end to that. Instead, Carlo Juho Stolberg became the first president of the Republic of Finland in 1919. The 1920s saw a great success. Progressive policies softened civil war tensions. Progressive taxation was introduced, and tenant farmers were given the right to own the land they worked, giving more people a stake in society. Compulsory education and military service were introduced. A less successful bill was Prohibition, 1919 to 1932, which led to widespread smuggling and crime until its repeal. An early building block of the Finnish welfare state was the creation of a national pension system in 1937. But the rising threat of the Soviet Union loomed over everything. In November 1939, Stalin's army swarmed across the border. The Winter War began. The vastly outnumbered and outgunned Finns fought with remarkable sisu, stoic determination. The nation stood largely united by the Winter War spirit, but the superior numbers of the enemy eventually drained the Finnish defence, and a peace treaty was signed in March 1940. Finland lost territory but maintained its independence. A defeat, but a moral victory that captured the world's imagination. With World War II in full swing and Germany invading the Soviet Union in 1941, Finland joined the offensive to regain its lost territories. This is known as the Continuation War, 1941 to 1944. Initially successful, the tide turned and the Soviet Union pushed the Finns back. The subsequent Moscow armistice forced Finland to drive the German troops out of Lapland, leading to the Lapland War, 1944 to 45, where retreating Germans burned much of northern Finland. The Paris peace treaties of 1947 had Finland cede more territory and pay hefty war reparations to the Soviet Union. While a burden, these reparations forced Finland to modernize its industry. The post-war era was defined by Finlandization, a policy of careful neutrality and avoiding any actions that might upset the powerful Soviet Union, even allowing Soviet interests to influence domestic policy. This was the price of survival. Some relief came with the successful 1952 Summer Olympics in Helsinki. The economy boosted with increasing exports and rapid industrialization. I've lost count of how many times I've said Finland was an agrarian society. By the 1970s, that was no longer true. The majority lived in cities. In the 80s, Finland had one of the highest standards of living in the world. Then, in 1991, a credit bubble burst, causing a deep depression and widespread unemployment. After the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, Finland felt free to join the European Union in 1995 and later NATO in 2023. At the turn of the millennium, Nokia was the world's largest mobile phone vendor, and Finnish metal bands like Nightwish, HIM, and Children of Bodom broke through internationally. From the retreating ice sheets to the Nokia ringtone, the history of Finland is a story of resilience. It's the story of a people who carved a life out of a harsh land, endured the whims of empires, and forged a unique identity through language, art, and an unwavering will to exist. They faced famines, wrath, and winter wars, and emerged to build a society that, despite its challenges, is consistently seen as a beacon of stability, education, and yes, happiness. The story continues, but the foundation is laid deep in the stone, iron, and sisu of the past. Forged in ice, tempered by fire, the story of a nation, that's the history of Finland. If you liked the video, please consider leaving comment on what should we cover next. Leave like and subscribe to see the next video.